Hi, my name is Holly West, and I'm the author of the Mistress of Fortune historical mystery series set in 17th century London. And I'm here with Tessa Lunney. She's the author of the Kiki Button historical mystery series, which includes April in Paris, 1921. That was the first book in the series. And the forthcoming Autumn Leaves, 1922, which is the book that we'll be discussing today. I'm in Northern California and she's in Sydney, Australia. And I just wanted to say thank you for agreeing to the interview. And it's so nice to meet you.
Wonderful to meet you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Tell us a little bit about Autumn Leaves, 1922.
Yep, sure. So it's the second in the Kiki Button Mysteries, as you said, which is a series of sexy spy thrillers set in and around 1920s Paris. It's written from the perspective of Kiki Button, my main character, who's a blonde Australian. She was a nurse and a spy through World War I, and then after a long route through her pandemic, going back to Australia, she's come back to Paris to live life to the full. What we see here in Autumn Leaves 1922, she's just spent a year home in Sydney after her mother's death, her mother's funeral, but then a long grieving process where she read all of her mother's diaries. And her mother is not the woman she thought she was. So Kiki's come back to Paris, firstly to find out who her mother really was. But once she's there, she's contacted by, firstly, all of her friends, which she loves, and her former spy master and current boss, Dr. Fox, who is getting her to do little piecemeal missions, much to her reluctance, but she feels she can't say no.
Anyone who is a fan of the series will really like this book. Simply because you're revisiting some really colorful, vibrant characters. Since we're talking about that cast of characters, they're bohemian and they're not shy about their pleasure-seeking ways. So, but I'm curious how typical they are for the time in which they live.
Well, there was a bohemian pocket around Montparnasse in the early 1900s. It was in Montmartre, and where that's with the Moulin Rouge and
yes,
and those things in the Art Nouveau time and Toulouse-Lautrec. And by the 20s, it had moved to Montparnasse, the left bank, as it's called. And the people who lived there were a lot of expats, and there are a lot of people who were sort of expats from their conservative Catholic families in the countryside as well. And they created this wonderful little world where they lived for art. They lived for art and modernism and making it new. All the surrealists and Picasso and Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, people would travel to Paris specifically to stay in Montparnasse to make art and to do something new. The rest of Paris was like a lot of other industrial Western cities. They've got all the middle class burghers and the politicians and the diplomats and the vast working class who live in conditions that were substandard, really. Although there was a lot of change in the 1920s where people were trying to improve the living conditions of the working class of Paris. But Montparnasse and that little bohemian enclave is like a special part of Paris.
Did the war have the World War I? Did that have a lot to do with this bohemian, like people who had survived it in the way that Kiki and some of her friends have? Did that have a bearing on the way they approached life?
Yes, I think it really did. And I think when you read things like The Great Gatsby and the intensity of their parties and the intensity of their emotions and their fervor, there's an edginess to it. There's no tomorrow. They party like there's no tomorrow. They, break up and make up like there's no tomorrow. Everything has to be done right now. And the past is gone and it's only the future. And I think that is a great deal come from the slaughter and the suffering that they had both seen and experienced during the war.
The political situation that you're writing about, because you also discuss what's going on in Russia and the revolutionaries and the Russian family are characters and Rasputin. He's not in it because he's dead, but it's very complicated. Did you put thought into how you were going to approach that? I know you had written the first book already, so the second book probably you were just taking some of that same spirit. But was that a difficult balance to achieve?
Well, because it's written from the first person, from Kiki's perspective, and these things are new for Kiki, she's learning them. So I can introduce I can introduce information a little bit at a time through her viewpoint. And she has a similar background to me, so I can, pick out bits of information and be like, this I found interesting, and this I found unusual, and this took me a long time to understand, so I'm going to explain it in a particular way. And also because of the people that she meets in Paris, she has a very particular interaction with something like the Russian Revolution. So she's got the Russian artists, some of whom are very left-wing and some of whom are not, who fought for France. And then she's got all the aristocrats who are obviously very anti-Bolshevik. And so that's also how she has an interaction with these ideas. And in that sense, it's not, you have to think about it, but it's not so hard because it's all very personal about how it affects her life. But to be honest, I love the period, and it is so complicated, and there's so much revolution after the war. From 1917 to about 1924 was continual political turmoil. And so the more I read, the more I want to read. And then when you know a lot, sometimes it becomes easy just to go, this is the important point.
Yes.
After having read 7 books, I can say this is what's important.
There is an art to all writing that requires research, and most writing does require research, but balancing out so that it doesn't seem like info dump is particularly hard, especially when you've got, I'll be honest, I know very little about Europe during World War I. I know much more about World War II than I do about World War I.
Yeah.
So it was really neat for me. Sound like a teenager. It was great for me to read and learn. And I realize it's still fiction, but I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Thank you.
So we discussed that Kiki is a former World War I nurse, a gossip columnist, and a spy, which is, that's quite a complicated character. Is she inspired by anyone in particular?
Not a particular person, but she has both historical and literary inspirations, I guess. So the literary inspirations is someone like Phryne Fisher. Do you know the Phryne Fisher books by Kerry Greenwood?
I do. Yes.
Yeah, so I've read them all and watched the TV series and the movie. And after a while, I wanted something more. I wanted something different. It's sort of permanently 1929 in Phryne's world, and she can eat vast amounts and never puts on weight, but also never loses weight. And she can she never gets too tired. And I thought, what would it be like if she had a body more like mine that gets fat or loses weight according to what I do? That has trouble, when I drink too much or when I don't sleep enough and when I'm heartbroken. And so that sort of that was one of the literary inspirations. But there's also things like A Movable Feast, which I love, and The Great Gatsby, which I've mentioned before, and I've read about 10 times and I keep reading it. Now it's locked down again in Sydney. I'll probably read it again. And I wanted to be in that world. Yeah. So I wrote myself into it. In terms of real life inspirations, I did a PhD on war fiction, specifically looking at silences in Australian war fiction, how a professional writer writes about what is incommunicable about the war experience. But because it was in a doctoral setting, I had the time and the resources to do a lot of research and a lot of reading, and I read a lot about World War I, and there are some amazing women doing amazing things, where it was quite constricted in the Edwardian period, and then World War I, and suddenly they needed everybody. And so women who'd been brought up to be nothing but wives and mothers were being nurses and bandaging people, and any woman who had a little bit more, just had wanted a little bit more, this was their chance.
Yes.
And there was a woman, for example, a Yorkshire woman called Flora Sanders, who joined the Serbian army and rose to the rank of sergeant major. And there are 2 nurses who set up the first casualty clearing station in Belgium. The army hadn't thought of it, so they're like, we know how to stop these soldiers dying. And they treated them on the front line. Marie Curie used her, discovery of radium to have a mobile X-ray van, which she drove around the front line, taking X-rays of limbs. So you can say if they're broken or not and how badly they're broken. And these kind of go on and on and on. And so that inspired me as well. And there's lots of not Mata Hari, although she's the most famous, but that women were spies in World War I, especially in the occupied territories in Belgium and northern France. And of course, studying 1920s Paris, people like Sylvia Beach and Nancy Cunard and Lee Miller and Josephine Baker and Kiki de Montparnasse, all these women who after the war just went, I'm not staying at home. That's it.
Yeah. I'm tasted life and now I'm going to live it.
Yeah. And sometimes it was because, well, the man I was going to marry is not here. I have to have a different life. But I think a lot of them was like, I never wanted that life. And now here's an opportunity. I don't have to. I'm going to travel to this place.
I'm going to make my own life.
I'm going to make my own life. Exactly. And if you were British or American, the exchange rate for the French franc was very helpful, shall we say. So, which is why the 20s were huge, because it was all boom and people had money. And then in the 30s, everything changed.
I hear stories like this, and it makes me kind of wonder, not that I ever really want to find out, but how would I react, or how would I have reacted to a wartime situation that would require me to be more than I ever expected I could be? And would I rise to the occasion, or would I step back? And I think the reality for me personally is that I probably would have stepped back. What do you think of yourself?
One of the reasons I like reading about war and war stories and writing them as well, is to try and put myself through those positions and to like think myself through, and then to use that template. What would I have done if my country had been invaded by the Nazis, if my country had been invaded by the Germans, if I was living in a tiny village, but the war was on, what would I have done? And then use the ideas that I might take from the war novel into my own life here. What would I have done from my research and my reading and my writing? The short answer is I don't know, because it depends on my situation. So 10 years ago when I started my PhD, I was a single young woman. Well, the risks I would have taken then and the courage I had then are different to now, when I'm a mother of 2 and my children are under 5. So I think as a young woman, I would have taken more physical risks, but I would have been more nervous and more concerned about myself. But now as a mother of 2, I don't want to take the physical risks, because then what would happen to my children? But at the same time, I'm much more determined to create a better world for them. And I can't, I want to, if I think there's a great World War I poster, it's a terrible idea, but it said, what did you do in the war, Daddy? Using shame to try and push men to join the army in World War I.
Wow.
But sometimes I think of, myself and my daughters, in their 10 years' time saying, why didn't you do this, Mum? And I want to be able to say, actually, I did everything according to my values.
Yes.
I really did try. And so I don't know what I would have done, because what you could have done is so complex. Is so complex. I find the most interesting is not what I would have done if I was one of my grandmothers in England or in Australia, but what would I have done if I was like my German friends' grandmothers? What would I have done then? How can you live in a like morally corrupt system? And what would you do? How do you live in a country that's been defeated so drastically, like Germany at the end of World War I?
Oh, absolutely.
They're the questions I'm asking myself now. Or my husband is Russian, which is right, the Russians will continue to make a presence in all of my writing. And he left the Soviet Union just as it was ending in 1991. So I think back to my mother-in-law or my grandmother-in-law and grandfather-in-law and just think, how would I have lived inside that system? What can you do? What does it mean to live inside that system at this point and at this point and at this point and at this point, as as time moves on and communism and Soviet communism becomes more entrenched, or capitalism changes, and through the different wars? It's a long answer.
I think that, I think that these things for me are worth discussing. And I think that's one of the reasons we read and one of the reasons we write, is to learn about ourselves. And when you're writing about war and when you're learning about war, you can't help but think more deeply about the subject matter, at least myself. And it sounds obviously like you as well, because it's a subject that you've studied at length. And you've studied not just the entertainment aspect of it as it applies to your writing, you've studied it on much deeper levels. And so I feel like that, long answer, but it requires some thought and it requires some length. But it's clear you know so much about the time period, that you're passionate about the time period. And I find that so, I don't know how you could write a book like this or a series like this without being passionate about the time period, and it's like you're so entrenched in it. Entrenched isn't the right word. You're so immersed in it.
Entrenched is a great
word. It comes out of you. It just comes out of you when you're writing it, as if you had lived it, kind of.
Yeah.
Or at least you're living in the world of which you write, which is a fictional world.
I appreciate that, because I read a lot about the 1920s when I was trying to take a break from my PhD. Like, I can't read about any more war trauma, but the 1920s, it's got a bit of trauma, but also a lot of fun. So I read and read and read. And there's a great book called Among the Bohemians by Virginia Nicholson, which is about Bohemian London in 1900 to World War II. And she's the granddaughter of Vanessa Bell, the grandniece of Virginia Woolf. She knew a lot of these people personally, and she just talked about not their art, but their lives. And that came at a critical moment for me when I was deciding to be a writer. So in terms of being immersed in the period, yes, I've been reading about it for 15 years. So,
And do you consider this crime fiction?
I call it a spy thriller, because there's no body. And there's no mystery, there's no theft, there's nothing that you would call a conventional crime. And spy thrillers, one of the reasons I like them is that the spies are agents for change. They're actively changing the world, often in the tiniest and most mundane ways. And once they do their work, if they're successful, nobody knows.
Yes.
And I feel that, it sounds silly, but I feel that I can identify. I want to be an agent for change, but anything that I do, I feel almost impotent. And so I look at the spies and go, well, that was the important but totally dispiriting meeting that they had, and that's what they had to do. And I can take comfort and hope from that. So I guess I see it as a spy thriller, but also Kiki doesn't really want to be a spy. She doesn't want to work for Fox because he's so manipulative. So she's sort of becoming a spy a little by little by little by little. Hopefully, as the series develops, she'll become better and better, and also more and more professional, less reliant on her friends and coincidence, and more able to make things happen.
So will there be a third Kiki Button novel?
I don't know. I hope so. I have an idea. I have a really great idea.
Yeah,
but we'll just see if it happens.
I hope that you're able to write that. I know with, in the world of publishing, sometimes these things aren't under our control. I mean, you could write the book, but it's not always under our control. But I hope you do write the book. In my own novels, I had real life historical figures, but my question for you and other authors who do it is, how do you approach that? And are there ethics of writing real historical figures that would be different than the fictional characters you write?
There's ethics and there's techniques, and I think they're different. And I think they're different in terms of ethics with historical characters. I think it depends what you do. So something like Paula McLean, who wrote The Paris Wife, can you see it up there in the corner? So she was writing Hadley Hemingway's story. And so I would feel that she had a great ethical responsibility to portray Hadley truthfully, because it's not a person that we get to hear from at all.
Yes.
And so she's writing an underwritten woman, whereas in my books, I have famous people come on as cameos, and they're often extremely famous, Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and Picasso. And I feel an obligation to be factually correct, but not such a great obligation because they say so much about themselves, number one. So many other people have said so many great things about them, number two. And number three, because they don't carry the emotional weight of the story. They don't carry the emotional burden of the story. They're fun cameos and also plot drivers. So that's what they're there for. Whereas I think much more deeply about the characters who carry the emotional weight of the story. For example, in the structure, if I look at it, I've changed action so that it's not all the women being injured in an action scene and then needing to be rescued by the men. Like that is not the structural story that I want to tell. So I'll change around who does what so that it has a different mix. And so for my fictional characters, actually, I feel a different kind of ethical responsibility, but it's the greatest responsibilities as those who's carrying the emotions. In terms of technique, because all my famous people are famous extras, really, little walk-on parts, I'm aiming for a vivid sketch. And sometimes there's an enormous amount of material, like for Hemingway, and sometimes there's not much at all. And so I use just like an idea as a bit of a springboard. For example, I've got a lot of Russian aristocrats in my novel, and I found out a bit about them, but not about all of them. And there were so many. And I don't think they all did amazing things, so people didn't write about them individually.
Yeah.
But Coco Chanel had an affair with one of them, and she said these Russians, tall, handsome, superb they are, and then behind that, nothing, hollowness and vodka. I'm like, well, I don't know if it's true, but it's a great idea. Like, it's a great springboard to create a little sketch that there's nothing behind them but hollowness and vodka. Yeah. So it really depends how many lines they have and what they do. But it's sort of when I say it's a sexy spy thriller, they're the kind of the sexy and the thrilling bits. So I use all the facts that I can, and then if I can't, I just make it up. Yes. And often I don't nearly need it to be plausible. It just has to be vaguely possible.
I think for myself, the way I looked at it was, I will make up dialogue for them, of course, but I would try to make it true to what the historical record has shown of them. So I wouldn't just be like creating characters for my own purposes. I would have them in their role in history. I would say that the king was like my number one person, and I kind of gave him, I wouldn't say he carried the emotional weight of the story, but he was a part of it, and it was important to me that he be a part of it. And so I probably gave him emotions or reactions that he might not have had, but I had done so much research on that time period for so long, and so many books, and all those books that you've got behind you, I have the same ones, only for 17th century England, right? Yeah. And so I felt like that was it was a lot of fun. Like I said, I was in love with him. I had like fallen in love with him. So I had to create this character based on this man that I had envisioned him to be.
Well, of course. I know. I want to be in 1920s Paris. I know. I want to be in 1920s Paris and see all these people. Exactly. I want to have an affair with a Picasso. So I will. And I just wrote it.
How did your writing process change with the second book?
Well, I had another baby, so it changed a lot. Yeah. So I had written a bit, and then I got pregnant, and I can't write when I'm pregnant. I can't think. So I had to leave it. And then when my little one was a month old, I picked it up again, and it was just the beginning of the pandemic. So baby plus pandemic created my writing habits, my writing routine. Everything I'd done before was out the window, and I just wrote whenever I could hand the baby over to someone else for an hour. I'd just sit down and write. And there were two reasons that I could do that. One, in the writing terms, I'd written out a very strong plot outline, so it didn't matter how little sleep I'd had or where I was. I just could look it up and go, okay, we're there in the plot, and then just write that scene. And the second was that Australia has good parental leave policies, and my workplace has very generous parental leave policies. So I had 11 months off work.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And it was paid as well. That meant I could afford to do it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So were you under contract for that novel?
Yeah, I was.
So it has a different, your pregnancy, if you can't write during your pregnancy, then you can't write during your pregnancy. But if you're under contract, you do have that little extra urgency to get the work done. A little more motivation.
I think I would have left it another 6 months until she was sleeping, but she was a month. I went, if I don't start now, we'll never get it done. And I think I begged for 2 extensions. And then I begged for another 2 extensions with the edits. I was editing up until it went to the printers. I'm like, please, just change this line.
You know what, though? More power to you, because I have no children. I don't work except to write. And so, the fact that you were in a pandemic, 2 children, the fact that you got it done and you did your job well, kudos to you. And I know
Thank
there's
you.
writers all over the planet that do the same thing. But I'm always in awe of people who juggle so many things to get their writing done. Is there any wisdom that you might want to impart?
Keep going. Yeah. Like everything in the world will conspire against you, and you just need to keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even if it's 10 minutes, I have a lot of support, so I don't want to give advice to people who have a lot less support than me, except to say identify sort of one by one the things that stop you and then work out a way to get over them. Yeah. And so for me, the thing that stopped me is time. I don't have enough time with an office job and 2 children. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, well, where can I have some more time? 5 a.m. All right. How do I get up at 5 a.m. No TV. All right, that's it. No TV at 9 p.m. You just got to stop. Or like eBay. Don't look at eBay. Don't look at Pinterest or Facebook when you're online. Yeah. So it just, but that's if you've got lots of time. If you've got literally 20 minutes,
you get it done. Yeah.
You just do it.
Said that they actually write more when they have less time. Because
I think I find the same.
Your focus gets fine-tuned or, honed in. The book, Autumn Leaves 1922, comes out on August 3rd from Pegasus Prime. And it's available where all books are in the U.S. It's distributed by Simon & Schuster. So it's available
everywhere.
Widely.
I'm wearing a cape. I don't know if you can see. It's made of silk velvet. And it's these wonderful colors, and it was given to me by a publisher who was given it by someone else, and she was a nurse in World War I and bought this in Paris in 1919. And it looks like it's barely been worn, but it's why I'm wearing it now, because it's my special Kiki. The colors are still so bright, and it's so soft and beautiful. It's got this wonderful fringe with a lovely fade. Yeah, it was just given to me. It was given to the publisher, and she said this is for you, really, writing Kiki Button. So it hasn't made its way into Kiki Button yet, but it will.
It's gorgeous.
It will. So that's
gorgeous on you.
Oh, thank you. And it's amazingly warm and comfortable. But yeah, it's just a big cape. Apparently they were all the rage in Paris in 1919. All the it girls had a velvet cape, a silk velvet cape. So this nurse, Australian nurse, before she went home, she bought herself one and clearly never wore it in Sydney because it's in beautiful condition.
Oh, wow. That is very, very special. I'm glad that you had a moment to interject and say, but wait, my cape.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So I've got a lot of visual material, as you see, this is how I write, surrounded by the stuff.
That you want to point out?
This book, Paris Between the Wars, can you see it? Was very important for my research. And this, I'll bring it a little bit forward, if you can see it. It's like a pinboard of ideas for this current book. So you've got some more Art Nouveau for Kiki's mother. And this is Charleston. This is where Vanessa Bell lived in Sussex. This is the Rotonde when I went there. It's a coaster for the Rotonde when I went there in 2018. Yeah. So probably this as well, my little pinboard that when I had a 1-month-old and I was desperately trying not to think about nappies and to think about cocktails, I'd have this in front of me and I'd put on this cape and some fancy shoes and play some, Parisian chanson music and drink coffee and go, I'm in Paris.
Yes.
And begin.
That's another thing that I should mention is that the book is transportive. It transports you to another place in time. Not always the most, there are heavy duty things happening in that time period, but it's different and fun and beautiful and evocative. And it was a good transportive read, which is what you need in a pandemic. Thank you again for...
Thank you, Holly. It's been lovely.
This was amazing and such an enlightening conversation.